They thought Ukraine was retreating. From the Russian command posts, the maps looked familiar. Ukrainian units were pulling back. Positions appeared abandoned. Roads that once burned with resistance now seemed open. To Moscow's planners, it looked like the moment they had been waiting for, proof that pressure was finally working, that the enemy was breaking, that another decisive push would bring victory closer. But war is not won by what you see on a map. What Russia believed was a collapse was, in reality, a calculated illusion, a carefully engineered silence, a deliberate pause designed not to escape the battlefield, but to reshape it. Ukraine was not retreating. Ukraine was baiting. In modern warfare, deception is as powerful as firepower. Every movement sends a message, and every message can be a lie. Ukrainian forces understood this better than anyone. They knew that Russia's doctrine depended on momentum, on exploiting perceived weakness, on pushing forward the moment resistance seemed to fade. So they gave Russia exactly what it expected to see: empty trenches, quiet villages, and an enemy that appeared to be running out of options. What Russia didn't see was what lay ahead. Hidden artillery was already positioned. Drones were watching every road. Precision weapons were locked onto choke points long before the first Russian vehicle rolled forward. The battlefield had been prepared not for defense, but for annihilation. When Russian forces advanced, they moved with confidence. Supply convoys followed. Armor pushed deeper. Commanders believed they were chasing a retreating enemy. Instead, they were stepping into a killing zone designed days, sometimes weeks, in advance. Then the trap snapped shut. Within minutes, the illusion collapsed. Roads turned into corridors of fire. Units found themselves isolated, exposed, and unable to maneuver. Communication broke down. Support never arrived. What was supposed to be a triumphant advance became chaos, confusion, and irreversible loss. This was not luck. This was strategy. Ukraine had mastered a new kind of warfare, one where patience defeats power, where intelligence outsmarts numbers, and where retreat can be the most dangerous weapon of all. By weaponizing deception, Ukraine turned Russia's own expectations against it, proving that even a larger force can be led straight into disaster if it stops questioning what it sees. This moment changed more than a single battle. It exposed the weakness of rigid thinking in a flexible war. It showed the world that modern conflicts are not just fought with tanks and missiles, but with psychology, timing, and the ability to control the enemy's perception of reality. Russia thought Ukraine was retreating. What it walked into instead was a death trap, and a lesson the battlefield will never forget. In war, retreat is often misunderstood. To the untrained eye, it looks like weakness, abandoned positions, silent front lines, fewer gunshots, fewer movements. To an impatient commander, it signals opportunity. And to an army driven by momentum and pressure, retreat looks like permission to advance. This is exactly what Russia believed it was witnessing. After weeks of grinding combat, Ukrainian forces appeared to be pulling back. Defensive lines that once resisted fiercely grew quiet. Villages that had been contested were suddenly empty. Trenches that once echoed with resistance seemed deserted. Surveillance feeds showed fewer Ukrainian vehicles on the roads. Intercepted communications suggested regrouping, not reinforcement. From Moscow's perspective, the conclusion was simple: Ukraine was losing ground. But this conclusion was not based on truth, it was based on expectation. Russian military doctrine has long relied on a dangerous assumption: when the enemy retreats, they are broken. When resistance fades, pressure must increase. When an opening appears, it must be exploited immediately. This mindset had worked in earlier conflicts, where overwhelming force often crushed disorganized opponents. Ukraine was not that opponent. What Russia failed to understand was that this retreat was not a reaction, it was a decision. A deliberate, calculated move designed not to escape the battlefield, but to redesign it. Ukrainian commanders knew exactly how Russian forces interpreted silence. They understood that empty ground would invite pursuit, and they knew that pursuit would expose Russia's greatest vulnerabilities. So Ukraine gave them space. not because they were weak, but because they were patient. Units withdrew just far enough to appear vulnerable, but not far enough to lose control. Key terrain was left open intentionally: roads, bridges, narrow passes, and supply routes that Russian forces could not resist moving through. What looked like abandonment was actually preparation. Behind the scenes, Ukraine was building something far more dangerous than a defensive line. Artillery units were repositioned with precision. Anti-armor teams moved into concealed locations. Drone operators mapped every possible route the advancing forces might take. Western supplied intelligence provided real-time data on Russian movements, logistics, and command structures. Every kilometer of open ground was being measured, timed, and targeted. The battlefield was becoming a funnel. Russia advanced, confident that momentum was finally on its side. Commanders believed they were chasing a retreating enemy. They pushed armor forward. Supply convoys followed closely behind, stretching logistics lines deeper into hostile territory. Air defense units lagged. Infantry spread thin. Speed replaced caution. And that was the moment Ukraine was waiting for. Because in modern warfare, distance is not neutral, it is dangerous. The farther an army advances without securing its flanks, the more exposed it becomes. The longer its supply lines stretch, the more fragile it grows. Ukraine understood this perfectly. They didn't need to defeat Russia head-on. They needed Russia to defeat itself by overextending. Silence on the battlefield wasn't emptiness, it was control. Russian forces mistook the absence of resistance for safety. They did not realize that every movement was being observed, tracked, and recorded. Ukrainian drones hovered unseen. Satellites fed targeting data. Artillery coordinates were adjusted in real time. What Russia believed was an open road was actually a corridor already marked for destruction. The illusion worked because it aligned with Russian expectations. Ukraine didn't invent a new narrative, it simply confirmed the one Russia already believed. That is the most powerful form of deception. Telling the enemy what they want to hear. By the time Russian units realized something was wrong, they were already deep inside territory designed to trap them. Retreat routes were limited. Choke points were unavoidable. Support units were too far behind to respond quickly. Communication lines became strained as electronic warfare disrupted signals. And still, Ukraine waited. This patience was not accidental. Ukrainian leadership understood that striking too early would expose the trap. The goal was not to scare Russia, it was to commit Russia. The deeper the advance, the greater the consequences. Every additional kilometer made the eventual strike more devastating. This was not a gamble. It was a strategy built on discipline, intelligence, and psychological warfare. Ukraine proved something critical in this moment. Retreat does not always mean surrender. Sometimes, retreat is the sharpest weapon on the battlefield. By stepping back, Ukraine forced Russia to step forward into vulnerability, into exposure, into a situation where power and numbers no longer mattered. Russia thought it was winning ground. In reality, it was losing control. And the moment Russia crossed the invisible line, the line Ukraine had been waiting for, the illusion of retreat would vanish, and the true nature of the battlefield would be revealed. The trap was set, and Russia was already inside it. A trap is not defined by the strike that ends it, but by the patience that precedes it. Ukraine understood this better than Russia ever anticipated. The most dangerous moment in deception is not setting the illusion. It is knowing exactly when to end it. And Ukraine waited. Russian forces continued advancing, convinced they had seized the initiative. Each kilometer forward reinforced their belief that Ukrainian resistance was collapsing. Commanders reported progress. Maps were updated. Supply routes were extended. Orders became more aggressive. Caution slowly disappeared, replaced by confidence. But confidence in war is often the prelude to disaster. What Russian leadership failed to grasp was that the battlefield was no longer neutral. It was being actively shaped against them. Ukraine was no longer reacting, it was orchestrating. Every movement by Russian units was anticipated, observed, and quietly absorbed into a broader plan that was already in motion. The first sign of trouble came not with explosions, but with confusion. Communication delays began to appear. Units advanced faster than their support could follow. Air defense systems lagged behind armored columns. Logistics convoys clustered along predictable routes. What looked like operational speed was, in reality, structural weakness. Ukraine had been waiting for this exact imbalance. Modern warfare is unforgiving to armies that move faster than they can protect themselves. The deeper Russian forces pushed forward, the narrower their options became. Retreat routes overlapped with supply lines. Choke points multiplied. The battlefield turned from open terrain into a funnel with only one direction of movement: forward. That was when Ukraine acted, not everywhere, but precisely where it mattered most. Rather than striking immediately at the spearhead, Ukrainian forces targeted the structure behind it. Logistics hubs, transport routes, and coordination nodes were disrupted. This wasn't about dramatic destruction, it was about paralysis. An army without fuel, coordination, or clarity is not defeated by force alone. It collapses under its own weight. Russian units at the front began to feel it first. Supplies slowed. Instructions became unclear. Support that was expected didn't arrive. Small delays compounded into serious problems. What had once felt like momentum now felt like isolation. Still, many Russian commanders believed they could push through. That belief was exactly what completed the trap. As pressure increased, Ukrainian forces shifted from shaping the battlefield to controlling it. Precision strikes closed escape routes. Key intersections were neutralized. Electronic warfare interfered with command and control systems. Russian units found themselves advancing into spaces where movement became restricted and coordination nearly impossible. This was not chaos by accident. It was chaos by design. Ukraine's approach demonstrated a deep understanding of Russian operational behavior. Instead of confronting strength with strength, Ukraine attacked dependence. Dependence on rigid command structures, predictable logistics, and centralized decision-making. When those systems faltered, even large formations became vulnerable. What followed was not a single decisive moment, but a cascade. Units that had advanced confidently now faced stalled progress. Attempts to regroup were slowed by limited communication. Supporting elements struggled to reposition quickly enough to stabilize the situation. Every solution introduced new complications. Every adjustment arrived too late. The battlefield no longer belonged to the advancing force. It belonged to the force that had prepared it. Ukraine's timing was critical. The trap was not sprung when Russia entered the area, but when it could no longer leave easily. This distinction is what separates desperation from mastery. Ukraine didn't want Russia to feel threatened early, it wanted Russia to feel committed. And by the time commitment turned into realization, options had already vanished. This moment revealed a profound shift in modern warfare. Victory was no longer defined by territory alone, but by tempo, perception, and control. Ukraine demonstrated that a smaller force, when disciplined and informed, could dominate a larger one by dictating how and when the battle unfolded. Russia's advance had become a liability. Every additional unit sent forward increased congestion. Every attempt to reinforce the front strained already fragile supply lines. The very scale of the operation, once considered an advantage, now worked against it. Meanwhile, Ukraine remained adaptive. Local commanders were empowered to act quickly. Intelligence flowed in real time. Decisions were decentralized, allowing Ukrainian forces to exploit fleeting opportunities without waiting for approval from distant command centers. This flexibility allowed Ukraine to maintain pressure while avoiding overextension. The trap was not a single event, it was a process, a slow tightening of space, time, and options. As Russian leadership struggled to regain control, the illusion of retreat was fully shattered. What had looked like weakness was revealed as restraint. What had appeared to be disorder was, in fact, discipline. Ukraine had not ceded the battlefield, it had reshaped it. And the consequences were undeniable. Russia did not simply lose ground in this phase. It lost initiative. It lost predictability. Most critically, it lost the ability to dictate the terms of engagement. From that moment forward, every move carried uncertainty. The trap had done its job, not by dramatic spectacle, but by strategic suffocation. Ukraine had proven that modern war rewards those who understand not just how to fight, but when to wait. By controlling tempo and perception, Ukraine transformed retreat into a weapon, patience into power, and expectation into vulnerability. Russia thought the battle was about advancing. Ukraine knew it was about control. And when the trap closed, the outcome was no longer in doubt, only the extent of its impact. When the noise faded and the battlefield settled, the true impact of the trap became impossible to deny. This was not just another tactical setback or a temporary reversal. It was a turning point, one that reshaped how the war was understood, not only by those fighting it, but by military analysts, governments, and strategists around the world. Russia had not merely lost ground, it had lost certainty. In the immediate aftermath, Russian forces were forced to reassess their positions. Units that had advanced with confidence now faced the reality of overextension. Command structures that depended on predictable movement and centralized control struggled to adapt to a battlefield that no longer behaved according to expectation. The illusion of dominance, carefully cultivated through numbers and firepower, had been cracked. Ukraine, meanwhile, did something just as important as winning the engagement. It stopped. There was no reckless pursuit, no dramatic overreach. Ukrainian forces consolidated, secured key areas, and reinforced positions methodically. This restraint sent a powerful message: Ukraine was not chasing headlines or symbolic victories. It was fighting a disciplined war of endurance, one designed to preserve strength while steadily eroding the enemy's capacity to respond. This contrast mattered. For Russia, the aftermath exposed a fundamental vulnerability. The operation had assumed that pressure alone could force collapse. Instead, pressure had been absorbed, redirected, and ultimately weaponized against the advancing force. What Russian planners had interpreted as weakness turned out to be operational maturity. The consequences rippled outward. Inside Russia's military establishment, questions emerged, not publicly, but quietly. Why had intelligence assessments failed? Why had Ukrainian capabilities been underestimated again? Why had familiar tactics produced unfamiliar results? These questions were dangerous because they challenged long-held assumptions about superiority, control, and inevitability. For Ukraine, the moment reinforced something it already understood. It did not need to match Russia tank for tank or missile for missile. It needed to outthink, outlast, and outmaneuver. This realization became a cornerstone of Ukraine's broader strategy moving forward. Globally, military observers took notice. Defense analysts across NATO and beyond studied the engagement closely. What they saw was not just a successful ambush, but a demonstration of modern, networked warfare. Intelligence integration, decentralized command, real-time surveillance, and psychological manipulation had combined into a cohesive strategy. This was not improvisation, it was evolution. The lesson was clear: numerical superiority means little without adaptability. Traditional doctrines that prioritized speed and mass were shown to be vulnerable in an environment saturated with sensors, drones, and precision capabilities. The battlefield was no longer opaque. Movement could be tracked, patterns could be predicted, mistakes could be punished with precision rather than brute force. Ukraine had turned transparency into a weapon. Another crucial lesson emerged around tempo. Ukraine controlled not just where the battle happened, but when it intensified. By delaying engagement, Ukraine forced Russia to reveal its intentions, stretch its resources, and commit fully before resistance peaked. This inversion of tempo, allowing the enemy to set itself up for failure, challenged conventional thinking. It also reshaped global conversations about retreat. For decades, retreat had been framed almost exclusively as failure. Ukraine demonstrated that, when executed deliberately, retreat could be an offensive act. It could manipulate perception, lure overconfidence, and create opportunities that direct confrontation could not. This insight resonated far beyond the conflict. Smaller nations facing larger adversaries saw proof that resistance did not require parity. It required intelligence, patience, and unity. Military academies revisited case studies. Strategists reconsidered doctrines. Even non-military sectors took note of the broader principle. Controlling perception can be as decisive as controlling resources. For Russia, the psychological impact was significant. Trust in assumptions was shaken. Each subsequent advance required more caution, more verification, more hesitation. That hesitation, in turn, slowed operations and reduced effectiveness. Momentum, once taken for granted, became fragile. Ukraine had achieved something rare in warfare. It forced its adversary to doubt itself. That doubt had lasting effects. Operations became more conservative. Risk tolerance declined. Opportunities were missed. In war, uncertainty is contagious, and once it spreads through command structures, it is difficult to contain. The aftermath also reinforced Ukraine's international support. Allies saw proof that assistance was not being wasted. Equipment, training, and intelligence were being integrated effectively. Ukraine was not only defending territory, it was advancing the art of modern defense. This strengthened political will abroad and deepened cooperation. But perhaps the most important outcome was internal. For Ukraine's forces and civilians alike, the engagement reaffirmed belief that discipline mattered, that sacrifice had purpose, that victory was not a fantasy, but a process built on countless deliberate decisions. This was not about celebration. It was about confidence. Confidence that strategy could overcome scale, that unity could overcome intimidation, that understanding the enemy could be more powerful than fearing them. Russia thought Ukraine was retreating. What it failed to see was a nation learning faster, adapting smarter, and fighting with a clarity of purpose that no illusion of strength could erase. The trap was not just a battlefield maneuver. It was a message that modern war belongs to those who think beyond force, who see patience as power, and who understand that sometimes the most dangerous step forward is the one taken by the enemy. And once that lesson was learned, it could not be unlearned. After the trap was revealed and its consequences became clear, the war did not simply continue as before. Something fundamental had changed. The battlefield itself remained the same, the terrain, the towns, the roads, but the way decisions were made, risks were calculated, and power was applied had shifted dramatically. This was no longer the war Russia thought it was fighting. For Russian leadership, the illusion of predictability had been shattered. The assumption that Ukrainian movements could be read at face value was gone. Every withdrawal now raised suspicion. Every quiet front invited doubt. What once looked like opportunity now carried the risk of catastrophe. This hesitation altered Russia's operational behavior. Advances slowed. Reconnaissance increased, but confidence decreased. Commanders demanded more confirmation before moving forward, more guarantees before committing forces. Yet in a fluid battlefield, guarantees do not exist. The result was paralysis at moments when speed once defined Russian doctrine. Ukraine had successfully weaponized uncertainty. Instead of responding to Russian moves, Ukraine now influenced them. The mere possibility of another trap forced Russia to reconsider every step. This psychological leverage became a strategic asset, one that required no ammunition, no fuel, and no reinforcements to maintain. The shift was subtle but profound. Where Russia once pushed broadly across multiple fronts, it began concentrating cautiously, probing instead of pressing. Where it once relied on mass, it increasingly relied on distance. Standoff tactics replaced aggressive maneuvering. This reduced immediate losses, but it also surrendered initiative. Ukraine recognized this change instantly. Rather than exploiting it recklessly, Ukrainian commanders adapted with discipline. They increased flexibility, kept forces mobile, and avoided predictable patterns. The goal was no longer just to counter Russian moves, but to remain unreadable. Every action was designed to preserve ambiguity. In modern war, ambiguity is power. Ukraine's strategy evolved from defense into control, not total control of territory, but control of tempo, perception, and escalation. Ukraine chose when to resist openly and when to disappear, when to show strength and when to conceal it. This made planning against Ukraine increasingly difficult. At the strategic level, this forced Russia into a reactive posture. Reactivity is costly. It drains resources, strains morale, and amplifies internal friction. When an army reacts instead of dictates, it loses the narrative of inevitability, the belief that its success is only a matter of time. That belief had been central to Russia's campaign. Now it was gone. The trap also accelerated a shift in Ukrainian military culture. Trust in decentralized decision-making deepened. Field commanders were empowered further, knowing that adaptability had proven decisive. Innovation was encouraged, not punished. Lessons were captured quickly and applied immediately. This speed of learning became a defining advantage. While Russia struggled to revise doctrine rooted in hierarchy and rigidity, Ukraine iterated in real time. What worked was reinforced. What failed was discarded. This feedback loop allowed Ukraine to remain ahead of the decision curve, even when resources were limited. Internationally, the strategic shift had ripple effects. Allies recalibrated their expectations. Ukraine was no longer seen solely as a defender holding the line, but as a force capable of shaping the conflict. This reframing influenced the type of support provided, not just weapons, but intelligence sharing, training focused on maneuver and deception, and systems designed for precision rather than volume. Support became more targeted, more strategic. For Russia, diplomatic pressure increased alongside military strain. Each stalled advance weakened narratives of control. Each cautious pause contradicted earlier claims of momentum. The gap between expectation and reality widened, and managing that gap became a challenge of its own. Inside the Russian system, this created tension. Military planners were caught between caution and demand. Political leadership wanted progress. The battlefield demanded restraint. This mismatch produced inconsistent operations, neither decisive nor sustainable. The trap had not just disrupted a battle, it had exposed systemic friction. Ukraine exploited this carefully. Rather than pushing everywhere, Ukraine applied pressure selectively. It tested weaknesses, forced reactions, then withdrew again. This rhythm kept Russian forces off balance while preserving Ukrainian strength. The war became less about seizing ground quickly and more about exhausting the enemy's ability to respond coherently. This was strategic maturity. Ukraine understood that wars of attrition are not won by constant engagement, but by forcing the opponent to spend more resources, more attention, more political capital for diminishing returns. Russia was now spending heavily just to avoid losses, not to gain advantages. Perhaps the most lasting shift was psychological. Russian forces no longer assumed superiority upon contact. Ukrainian forces no longer assumed inferiority. This inversion mattered more than numbers. Confidence shapes behavior, and behavior shapes outcomes. Ukraine fought with purpose. Russia fought with caution. The trap marked the moment this balance became visible. From that point forward, every Russian advance carried doubt, and every Ukrainian withdrawal carried threat. The battlefield was no longer a place of clear signals. It was a space of constant interpretation where mistakes were amplified and certainty was rare. Ukraine thrived in that environment. It had learned to fight not just with weapons, but with ideas, deception, patience, and discipline. These tools did not wear out. They did not depend on supply lines. They multiplied in effectiveness as the enemy became more uncertain. The strategic shift was complete. The war had moved beyond raw force into a contest of cognition and control. And in that contest, Ukraine had seized an advantage that no single battle could erase. Russia thought Ukraine was retreating. What followed was a transformation of the war itself, one where power was measured not by how far an army could advance, but by how effectively it could be made to hesitate. And hesitation, once learned, is hard to unlearn. History does not always change with a single explosion or a dramatic victory. Sometimes it changes quietly, when assumptions fail, when old rules stop working, and when one side realizes too late that the war it prepared for no longer exists. That is what happened here. Russia entered the battlefield with a mindset shaped by the past: mass, pressure, momentum, and inevitability. Ukraine answered with something far more dangerous: adaptability, deception, and control over perception. The trap that Russia walked into was not just a tactical maneuver. It was a signal that the nature of war itself had evolved. This was not about who had more weapons. It was about who understood the battlefield better. Modern warfare is no longer defined by what an army possesses, but by how intelligently it uses information. Ukraine demonstrated that awareness can replace armor, that timing can defeat numbers, and that restraint can be more lethal than aggression. The battlefield became a space of constant observation, where every movement was visible and every mistake could be exploited. In this environment, speed without understanding became a liability. Russia's advance exposed a critical weakness shared by many large, conventional forces: reliance on rigid doctrine. Plans were built on assumptions that no longer held. Retreat was misread as collapse. Silence was mistaken for absence. Space was interpreted as opportunity. Ukraine exploited every one of these assumptions. By allowing Russia to believe it was winning, Ukraine gained something more valuable than territory: predictability. Once Russia's behavior could be anticipated, it could be shaped. Once it could be shaped, it could be trapped. This represents a fundamental shift in warfare. For centuries, strength was measured by visibility: armies, formations, flags, firepower. Today, strength is often invisible. It exists in data links, intelligence fusion, decentralized command, and the ability to manipulate the enemy's understanding of reality. Ukraine fought a transparent battlefield with invisible intent. Another defining feature of this shift was decentralization. Ukrainian forces did not wait for perfect orders from a single command center. They empowered local leaders to act on real-time intelligence. This flexibility allowed rapid adaptation and prevented paralysis when conditions changed. In contrast, centralized control slowed Russia's response. When plans failed, adjustments took time. When communication faltered, initiative vanished. The trap exposed how dangerous rigidity can be in an environment where information moves faster than orders. The lesson was unmistakable: adaptability beats authority. This moment also redefined the role of retreat. No longer merely a response to pressure, retreat became a deliberate tool. By choosing where not to fight, Ukraine determined where the fight would happen. By stepping back, it forced Russia forward into exposure, overextension, and uncertainty. Retreat became offense. This challenges centuries of military thinking and will influence doctrine far beyond this war. Armies around the world are now re-examining how they interpret enemy movement, how they define momentum, and how quickly confidence can become vulnerability. Technology amplified these effects, but it did not replace strategy. Drones, surveillance, and precision weapons mattered because they were integrated into a coherent plan. Ukraine did not simply collect information, it acted on it intelligently. Data became decision-making power, not just awareness. This integration is the future of warfare. Those who fail to connect intelligence, command, and action will fall behind, regardless of how many weapons they possess. Ukraine showed that modern war rewards systems thinking, not isolated strength. Psychologically, the impact was just as profound. Russia lost more than units or positions; it lost trust in its own judgment. Every quiet front became suspicious. Every advance carried doubt. This erosion of confidence slowed operations and drained initiative. An army that questions its assumptions fights cautiously, and caution can be exploited. Ukraine gained the opposite. Confidence rooted not in superiority, but in understanding. Understanding the enemy's habits, fears, and expectations. Understanding when to fight and when to wait. Understanding that wars are not won by reacting faster, but by thinking deeper. This cognitive dimension of warfare is now impossible to ignore. Global military institutions are studying this moment not for tactics alone, but for mindset. The realization is unsettling. Traditional advantages can be neutralized without direct confrontation. Power can be redirected. Scale can be turned inward, becoming a burden rather than a benefit. For smaller nations, this lesson is empowering. It proves that survival and success do not require matching an adversary blow for blow. They require discipline, unity, intelligence, and the courage to resist predictable responses. For larger powers, the lesson is sobering. Dominance can no longer be assumed. Force without adaptability invites failure. Visibility without control invites deception. Confidence without understanding invites traps. The battlefield has become a test of learning speed. Those who learn faster win. Ukraine learned faster. The trap that Russia walked into was not the end of a campaign. It was the beginning of a new era of warfare, where control of perception matters as much as control of land, where patience can defeat power, and where the most dangerous weapon is not the one you see, but the one you misunderstand. Russia thought Ukraine was retreating. What it failed to recognize was a transformation unfolding in front of it, a transformation that will shape conflicts long after this war ends. Because once warfare changes, it never goes back, and the armies that fail to change with it are the ones most likely to walk into the next trap. In the end, the most important battles are not always the loudest ones. They are the moments when assumptions collapse, when confidence turns into confusion, and when one side realizes, too late, that the war it prepared for is no longer the war it is fighting. That is the legacy of this moment. Russia believed it was witnessing retreat. It believed the familiar signs of exhaustion, withdrawal, and weakening resistance. Those signs had meant victory before. They had worked against others. They had justified speed, pressure, and escalation. But this time, those signs were not truth. They were bait. Ukraine did not win this moment by overwhelming force or dramatic confrontation. It won by understanding something deeper, that modern warfare is not about how hard you push, but about how well you read what is happening in front of you. Russia pushed forward. Ukraine stepped aside. And in that space between action and understanding, the trap was born. This was not accidental. Every withdrawal had a purpose. Every quiet front carried intent. Every open road was watched. What looked like absence was actually preparation. What appeared to be weakness was discipline. Ukraine chose patience over pride and control over chaos. And that choice changed everything. Once the trap closed, the consequences were not limited to the battlefield. Russia did not just lose units or momentum, it lost clarity. The certainty that once drove decisions disappeared. Every future movement required more caution, more verification, more fear of repeating the same mistake. That fear became a permanent presence. For Ukraine, the opposite occurred. Confidence grew, not reckless confidence, but grounded belief. Belief in strategy. Belief in adaptability. Belief that the war could be shaped, not just endured. Ukraine proved to itself and to the world that intelligence, unity, and discipline could stand against size and pressure. This belief mattered as much as any tactical success. Wars are sustained not only by resources, but by meaning. Soldiers fight differently when they understand why patience is chosen over aggression, why restraint is strength, and why retreat can be a weapon. Ukraine internalized this lesson, and it became part of its identity. The world was watching. Military planners, analysts, and governments took note because this moment exposed a truth that could no longer be ignored. The age of predictable warfare is ending. Technology has stripped away invisibility. Intelligence flows faster than commands. Mistakes are punished immediately, and the side that learns faster gains an advantage that no stockpile can replace. Ukraine learned faster. Russia, bound by expectation and tradition, learned slower. That difference defined the outcome. This was not about humiliation or spectacle. It was about evolution, about the shift from wars of force to wars of cognition, from domination through mass to control through understanding. The battlefield became less about territory and more about perception, who sees clearly, who misread silence, who mistakes opportunity for safety. Russia mistook silence for surrender. Ukraine turned silence into strategy. That is why this moment will be remembered long after individual battles fade. Not because of a single maneuver, but because it revealed how power can be redirected, how momentum can be stolen, how the strongest step forward can sometimes be taken by the enemy at your invitation. The trap worked because it respected reality. Ukraine did not assume the enemy would fail. It planned for success and shaped it into vulnerability. It accepted short-term discomfort to achieve long-term advantage. It resisted the urge to prove strength immediately, choosing instead to reveal strength at the moment it mattered most. That level of discipline is rare, and once demonstrated, it cannot be unseen. From this point forward, retreat will never be interpreted the same way. Silence will never feel safe, and every advance will carry a question. Is this real, or is this another invitation? That question is Ukraine's enduring victory. Russia thought Ukraine was retreating. What it failed to understand was that it was walking into a lesson, one written not in noise or spectacle, but in patience, preparation, and control. A lesson that reshaped the war, unsettled assumptions, and redefined what it means to be powerful in the modern battlefield. Because in today's wars, the most dangerous weapon is not force, it is understanding. And the side that masters it decides not only where the enemy moves, but how the war itself will be remembered.